Hello, Lone Oak. My name is Aaron Spencer. Many of you know my story. I'm the father who acted to protect his daughter when the system failed. That's why I'm announcing my candidacy to run for Lone Oak County Sheriff.
This is a true story. Out of respect for the dead, the rest has been told exactly as it occurred. There are no easy cases in our line of work, but there are cases that break you. Those that make you question the very essence of the law you're sworn to uphold. The case that began on a dark October night on the side of the highway was precisely that. It smelled of ozone after rain, gunpowder, and a tragedy that could no longer be undone. It all started with a 911 call. Calls are always filled with screams, panic, and labored breathing. But not this one. The voice on the recording was calm, terribly calm, as if it wasn't a person speaking, but a machine with all its emotional wires pulled out. "Hello, 911. What's your emergency?" the dispatcher responded. A pause. Then a calm male voice. "I want to report a shooting." "Sir, are you a witness?" "No, I shot." Another pause, this time from the dispatcher. I've listened to this recording dozens of times, and each time I'm chilled by that icy composure. "Sir, where are you?" He gave the exact coordinates. An intersection of the highway, not far from an old sawmill. He dictated the make and license plate number of his pickup truck, and the make of the second vehicle, a truck. "Are there any casualties?" The dispatcher's voice trembled. "Yes, one person. He's dead." When we arrived at the scene matched his description perfectly. The flashing lights of patrol cars cut through the darkness, painting the wet asphalt blue and red. Two cars were parked at the side of the road, an old pickup truck and a battered semi-truck. Between them on the ground lay a body. A man about 70 years old in work clothes. He was covered with a tarp, revealing only worn-out boots. And there he was, leaning against the door of the pickup truck. The killer. He didn't try to run. He didn't resist. He simply waited. A tall, powerfully built man, his hands in his jeans pockets, his face a stony mask. When the officers handcuffed him, he didn't even flinch, as if it were a long-awaited, inevitable part of the ritual. I walked closer. In the light of the lantern, I saw his eyes, empty, burnt to ashes. These weren't the eyes of a cold-blooded killer, reveling in his power. These were the eyes of a man who had been through hell and brought it with him to this side of the road. The first mystery emerged when we peered into his truck. A teenage girl was sitting in the passenger seat. His daughter, we later discovered. She wasn't crying. She was simply staring at something, huddled in a ball, shaking as if an ice storm were raging inside her. We handed her over to the paramedics and wrapped her in a blanket. She didn't say a word. What happened here? A father murders an elderly man in front of his own daughter? Jealousy? A road rage incident gone wrong? Theories swirled in my head, but none fit this frozen calm, this atmosphere of justice served, not crime. The answer began to emerge a few hours later when the forensics team finished examining the shooter's home. Detective Hargrove called me. His voice was strange, muffled. "Boss, you need to hear this," he said. "We checked your daughter's room. It's protocol." "What's there?" I asked, expecting to hear about signs of a struggle, something that would explain this outburst of violence. There. Everything was perfectly tidy, except for one thing. In her bed, under the covers, there was a sweatshirt, a hoodie. It was folded so that from a distance it looked like someone was sleeping there. I was silent, trying to comprehend. It was a deception. The girl hadn't simply left home. She had faked her presence. She had escaped. Dad must have come in to check on her during the night, Hargrove continued, as if reading my mind. He saw that mannequin. Can you imagine what he felt? Panic, horror. He rushed to look for her and found her in the truck of that guy who's now lying on the pavement. The picture began to come together, slowly, like a puzzle of shards of glass. A father discovering his daughter had been tricked into leaving home, a desperate search in the night, and a horrific discovery. And then a collision on the highway and gunshots. But that was just the beginning. The real storm began a few days later when a package from the shooter's lawyers arrived at my office. Inside was no official document, no motion. It was a press release, just one page. And the headline in bold type made me realize this case would become more than just a trial, but a war. The headline read, "The Story of a Heroic Father." I looked at those words and felt the ground shift beneath my feet. They weren't going to plead for leniency. They weren't going to prove a state of passion. They were going to turn a murderer into a saint. And I realized that I would be judging not a man, but the legend they would create on his bones. A legend against which my facts, evidence, and laws might prove powerless, can never be erased from the asphalt, from memory, from the history of the small town. This case became a crack in the foundation, and I felt it spreading right under my desk. The first days after Aaron Spencer's arrest passed in the usual routine: evidence gathering, interrogations, indictment filing. Everything was crystal clear. A man had taken the law into his own hands. He had tracked down another man, Michael Fossler, and shot him dead on the highway. The motive? Revenge. Fossler had been accused of abusing his daughter and, unfortunately, was out on bail. The law, in its imperfections, had given Spencer an excuse to take the law into his own hands. On paper, it was all simple. Second-degree murder, pure as distilled water. But then they entered the picture. Aaron Castanelli and Michael Kaiser, Spencer's lawyers. They weren't just lawyers, they were orchestrators of public opinion, PR masters, selling a story rather than defending a client. I first understood the scale of the problem when I saw their press release. It sat on my desk, typed on expensive paper, and every word of it was poison to my case. They didn't name Spencer as the defendant. They called him a heroic father. The phrase was splashed across every news channel. It was front-page news, headlined on the evening news. A heroic father who protected his daughter. Aaron Spencer, the man who pulled the trigger, was transformed into a vigilante. And Michael Fossler, the murder victim, was transformed into a monster who got what he deserved. The fact that Fossler's guilt hadn't yet been proven in court mattered little. The lawyers delivered their verdict on prime-time television. I was sitting in my office late one evening, the light from my desk lamp illuminating stacks of files from the gloom. The city roared outside, but my head was filled with the hum of the Kaiser's television interview I'd just watched. He looked straight into the camera, his face awash with righteous indignation. "Put yourself in his shoes," he said. "Any father would have done the same." Any father? This wasn't a defense. It was an incitement. A call to anarchy, cloaked in concern for family values. They weren't just protecting Spencer. They were poisoning the well from which I would draw the jury. Every potential jury member had already heard the story. Everyone had already tried on the role of avenger. I knew I was losing the battle before it even began. My evidence, the shell casings, the ballistics, the recording of Spencer's 911 call, where he calmly states, "I shot a man," all paled in comparison to one detail the lawyers savored with particular cynicism. The hoodie. The sweatshirt Spencer's daughter had placed in her bed to simulate a sleeping body when she ran off to Fossler's. For them, it was proof of their father's despair at finding an empty bed. For me, it was a catalyst, but not an excuse. The law makes no allowance for emotion when it comes to taking a life. I had to act. Silence them. Not for myself, but for justice. Justice should be blind, not blinded by the flashes of television cameras. I spent the entire night preparing a motion, a gag order, a legal gag that would shut down this flood of disinformation. I demanded that everyone, the defense, the prosecution, the witnesses, the families, be barred from speaking to the press. I demanded that the case file be sealed so that reporters couldn't cherry-pick their quotes. On the morning of December 4th, my motion landed on Judge Barbara Elmore's desk. I waited for a hearing to be scheduled. I expected to meet Casanelli and Kaiser in the courtroom and argue about free speech and the right to a fair trial. I was preparing for battle. But there was no battle. On December 10th, the court clerk called me. "The judge has signed your motion, in full. The order is effective immediately." I hung up. Silence. Judge Elmore hadn't scheduled a hearing. She hadn't listened to the defense's arguments. She had simply delivered the surgical blow. In that moment, I felt relief, even triumph. I had brought this case back from the television screens into the courtroom where it belonged. For months, a thick, unfamiliar silence reigned. The press fell silent. Spencer's lawyers disappeared from the airwaves. I was free to work, preparing my case, constructing the logic of my presentation to the jury. I studied every detail of that October night, listening over and over to Spencer's 911 call. His voice, calm, devoid of panic, didn't fit with the defense's portrayal of a father in a state of emotional distress. He was cold-blooded. He was a killer, and I was going to prove it. These. I'd almost forgotten how easily I'd gotten the gag order. Too easily. Such victories always come at a price. And the price came in the form of an official envelope from the Arkansas Supreme Court. Spencer's lawyers weren't resigned to defeat. They appealed. They argued that Judge Elmore's order was a gross violation of their client's constitutional rights. A violation of the right to free speech and a public trial. They claimed the judge had abused her discretion by rendering her decision without a single hearing. And the Supreme Court accepted their appeal for consideration. I was no longer the hunter. Now they were hunting my main weapon, silence. My entire strategy was in jeopardy. The murder case faded into the background. A new war had begun. A war for the right to speak. On the evening of May 28, 2025, I sat in my office just as I had 6 months earlier. It was getting dark again outside. On my desk lay the same press release, now yellowed at the edges. Heroic father. I knew the Supreme Court would issue its decision the following morning. A decision that would either return chaos or preserve the fragile order I had established. Everything depended on it. Would I be able to present the facts to the jury, or would they be fed more beautiful lies? I stared at the photo in the case file. Aaron Spencer's smiling face, taken long before that night. A father, a husband, and now, a murderer the entire country was ready to acquit. And I waited for the decision that would determine not only his fate, but the true worth of our justice system when faced with the father's rage. My phone was silent, and that silence was louder than any scream. The indictment. But this wasn't a case that lived solely on paper. It lived in newspaper headlines, in angry online comments, in whispers at coffee shops across the state. Spencer's lawyers, Aaron Casanelli and Michael Kaiser, weren't simply defending their client. They were forging a myth. The myth of the heroic father. The avenger who did what the system couldn't muster. Every press release they issued was a carefully crafted hammer blow to the foundation of my case. Every television interview where they declared with righteous indignation that anyone in their place would have done the same was poison that slowly seeped into the minds of the future jurors. They weren't looking for vindication. They were looking for national approval, and worst of all, they found it. I watched Aaron Spencer transform from a second-degree murder defendant into a folk hero, and I, a prosecutor doing my duty, became a heartless functionary persecuting a righteous man. I couldn't let that happen. The law isn't a popularity contest. My response was a gag order. Even the name itself sounds harsh, like a gag. I demanded that the court prohibit all participants in the trial, lawyers, witnesses, families, even myself, from speaking to the press. I wasn't trying to silence the truth. I was trying to give it a chance to be heard in the silence of the courtroom, not drowned out by the shouts of the crowd. Judge Barbara Elmore granted my motion. Victory. The paper with her signature landed on my desk, and for a moment, the office was filled with the silence I'd been seeking for this entire case. But there was a flaw in this victory. A tiny crack that I dismissed at the time as insignificant. The order was entered, without a hearing. The judge simply read my motion, agreed with its arguments, and signed it. A victory achieved in silence struck me as suspicious. Justice abhors a vacuum. And of course, the defense pounced on this procedural error like a hungry wolf. Casanelli and Kaiser appealed, not to the district court. They went all in, straight to the Arkansas Supreme Court. Now something bigger than Aaron Spencer's case was at stake. This was a battle over the right to free speech versus the right to a fair trial. A battle that the entire country was watching. The months of waiting dragged on like thick tar. Winter gave way to spring. Spencer's case, sealed and shrouded in a gag order, smoldered beneath the surface. But I knew it was the calm before the storm. And then on May 29th, the answer arrived. Not a loud phone call, not an urgent subpoena. A simple email with an attachment. The Supreme Court's ruling in Spencer v. Arkansas. I opened the document. My fingers glided over the mouse, scrolling through pages of dry legalese until I found what I was looking for. The executive summary. The court's words were cold and sharp like a surgeon's scalpel. A gag order issued without a preliminary hearing is a gross abuse of discretion. Gross abuse. That sentence hit me harder than any jury verdict. The court hadn't simply overturned Judge Elmore's decision. It had publicly flogged her, and me along with her. The order was quashed. The case was unsealed. The dam I'd so painstakingly built had collapsed. The waters of public opinion had come flooding back, and now they were even more turbid and furious. I closed my laptop. The office was quiet, but the silence no longer brought peace. It was deafening. I had lost. We hadn't lost the motion. We had lost the right to silence. Now Aaron Spencer's trial would take place under the spotlight, under the gaze of television cameras, under the pressure of thousands of people who had already rendered their verdict. I picked up his folder again. I looked at the photograph of the man who had taken justice into his own hands. I remembered that detail, that crumpled hoodie in his daughter's bed, mimicking a sleeping figure, a symbol of the deception that had set the bloody mechanism in motion. I remembered the recording of his 911 call, the calm, almost detached voice announcing that he had just shot a man, a complex, tragic man, now reduced to a simple, convenient symbol. The Spencer case was still waiting for its time, but for me it had already become a ghost. A reminder that the law isn't always a scale. Sometimes it's a stage. Several months passed. Aaron Spencer's story continued to live its own life, and I lived mine. Papers, interrogations, new cases. One rainy autumn day, as gray drops pounded the glass of my window, the phone rang. Not from the homicide department, from the economic crimes department. The voice on the other end of the line was quiet, almost colorless. An hour later, a new folder sat on my desk. Not thick like Spencer's, filled with crime scene reports and interrogation reports. It was thin, the color of withered grass. Inside were no photos of blood-stained puddles or angry faces. Only bank statements, offshore schemes, and a single medical examiner's report on the cause of death, which initially looked like an accident. There was no father's rage here defending his child. There was no clear, albeit illegal, motive. There was the chill of a safe deposit box and the faint scent of bleach, which, as it later turned out, someone had used to carefully cover their tracks. But that was just one chapter. Ahead of me lay a case in which the blood ran not hot, but cold, like a calculation in a ledger. And the monster wore not a broken heart, but an impeccably pressed suit.